This show is taped at La Cenne, a space for creation and collaboration. Artists, thinkers, and creators of all stripes tell us what inspires their work, a starting point that takes us into their creative process in their own words. Welcome to Who Inspires You? Dallett is a media performance installation artist. He studied art history and architecture and then received a master's in media and fine arts from Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Tim worked as media director and artistic director of the Saskatoon artist-run center Paved Arts. And since moving to Montreal, Tim has developed his individual practice as well as a collaborative project called the Artifact Institute. Tim, hello, welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks
Sure.
for being here. So let me jump right in and ask you, who inspires you?
Great. Well, we talked about this before, and I had all kinds of inspirations and eventually kind of settled on two that made sense to talk about because I think they're the most directly related to the work I'm doing right now. We're trying to do as an individual artist as opposed to the collaborative projects I do.
Yeah.
And these are two artists, one German, one American, who came to prominence in the 1970s, and I guess what I'm taking most from their work is their work from that time. So Ulrike Rosenbach, who's a German performance artist, known mostly for performances, but also for video and installation, and Dan Graham, who's an American artist, who works also in those media, but in a very different way. And
they were both real pioneers of like video art and video performance art.
Sure. I mean, there were other artists. They weren't necessarily the first people to use video in contemporary art. I mean, that title nominally goes to Nam June Paik as the first artist to use a video tape recorder and a camera in an artistic context. But nonetheless, they were key to the development of a kind of early grammar of how video was appropriated by artists and put into a new way of investigating time and relationships around performance and space.
Ulrike is known for having done this performance where she's pulling an arrow or shooting an arrow at famous works of art.
Sure. Well, her work is grounded in a feminist critique of art history and also a very strong conception about how women artists needed to assert themselves in the art media of the time. And so she developed a number of personae through her performances, which were very distinctive and involved the gesture and kind of very striking imagery as a way to get her point across. And this particular performance, I even have to get the title in German to get that to be the right...
How's your German?
It's not bad in terms of pronunciation, but I can't say I really speak the language. So, glauben Sie nicht, dass ich eine Amazon bin. Don't believe that I'm an Amazon, or don't believe I am an Amazon from 1973. So, I mean, ultimately it's disseminated as a videotape, but it was a live performance where she's firing arrows from a bow and arrow at works from art history that she sees as maybe kind of central to how women were represented historically in art. But what I take from this, and this is the thing we talked about earlier, but it's maybe worth mentioning that often as an artist, if you're taking inspiration from something, you're taking what you find there, not necessarily what that artist themselves thinks is most important, or even the art world in general, or critics and curators. So I'm trying to find something personal that is really inspiring my own work. And what I'm taking here is this role of the performer, the live video image, and the gesture that connects with an audience, specifically through the medium of video, because in this piece, there's a close-up of the painting and the arrow. There's sort of an identification of the arrow with the camera, with the target, and you're very aware of the liveness of this gesture of firing the arrow. And time is sort of happening in a way that's not really, let's say, edited time or television time. It's in a kind of the real time of this event.
Live time.
And I mean, of course, television can also be live too, so there's like a unique dimension to that. But I think this idea of video as a live medium, and that's what I work in. I don't make recordings per se. I don't edit videotape, and maybe that happened because I came of age or kind of got involved in video around the time of the transition from analog to digital in the mid-late 90s, and working with video storage was really frustrating, and so I really got tired of dealing with this and realized I was more interested in the live image as something that was put into a context of viewers to experience, rather than making a tape and then sending it out. I wanted to be there and have a relationship with the people who are watching the image and generate it live.
Yeah, and so you are, though, even though you are performing live, you're mediating the relationship between you and the audience with video.
Exactly, because I found through a couple of failed performances, I would say, not to appear personally on stage or kind of in a gallery in front of live spectators, just in a kind of person-to-person relationship as we're doing now.
Yeah.
I really felt much more comfortable and thought I could develop a more interesting approach that I could bring more to by working a live performance in a space and creating a relationship with an audience by sending them a video image and producing it live, but not necessarily being directly seen. But yet there's still an awareness that they, at some level, know that I'm there and I know that they're there, or I think someone might be watching. But it's the interface of the screen and the image and the signal is what creates the relationship. But also the space, too, because in some cases, I've done works where I'm in a space and I can hear people walking around on the floor above. And so in some ways, I'm being influenced by the fact that I know someone's there. So if I'm on camera, there might be someone who's very quiet. I don't know. I have to assume someone's maybe watching. But if someone's watching, then they maybe perceive that I react to them, even though I don't see them. There's kind of like a 1.5 way.
Yeah. But is that a strange thing as a performance artist, not really ever knowing what's going on, how your stuff is received because it's mediated through
Well, that's a great way to put it, because I realized at some point that I'm never going to occupy exactly the position of the spectator. And if someone was making a painting or conventional sculpture, they can make this object, put it on display, and then go look at it. Obviously, they can't get rid of the consciousness that they made it, but they can still assume the same spatial and kind of perceptual relationship to this object. In my case, sometimes what I do just to see what's going on, I could make a documentation recording, play it back, and go out and look. And you don't ever document. Well, that's not true. I do make recordings, but I don't disseminate the work as recorded videos. So you kind of have to be there to get it. You have to be at the site to experience it as a live process. And so if I want to see what that is, I have to do kind of test research and go look at what happens. And so I do this as part of my process developing the piece. But when there's the live event, I can never occupy the place of the spectator. And I'm still thinking there's a lot of potential in that I've yet to even sort of scratch the surface of, because it depends on the site, too, where it's happening. I don't know, some of those images that I sent you were at a project in Gatineau, where I'm moving between two spaces, one of which is out of view because it's a basement. The other is a kind of attic that was once a projection booth, but it's a backlit rear screen, so my shadow appears in silhouette when I'm there. And the audience can see when I've appeared. I can't directly see them, but there is this strange sense of the shadow silhouette as an index of the performer. And yet they're watching other imagery that I create with other cameras. And so they see my hands moving, or me moving a wheelbarrow with cameras mounted on it. And there is a kind of tension created between us. And a lot of your work, or at least some of the work that I've seen, you use repetition a lot. And I wonder what you're trying to convey in some of these repetitive images, or with jump cuts, for example, in video. Well, that's, I guess, the idea of routine and repetition and doing a process that is cyclical and goes over again is part of the idea that I'm not doing conventional stage performance or a kind of les arts de la scène where there is maybe a somewhat spectacle aspect, but it's low key and it's long duration. So sometimes I've done shorter works where there's more of a kind of a beginning and an end within a short time. But if something is going on over a week, or 12 hours a day for a week, what I'm trying to do, because I'm also not an actor, I'm not a musician, I'm not a live performer, I'm not a dancer, I don't have those skills, I can't carry myself that way and I can't present myself that way. What I can do is draw on a kind of analytic process and experience doing things like construction and audiovisual contracting and being a technician and being someone who works with space as a kind of thing you intervene in to make something happen, and create routines where I'm investigating a space and I'm doing an activity over and over again. And to me, I would rather follow a routine than try to do a virtuosic gesture. And so there are a lot of other precedents.
So there's virtue in routine. There's something that can come out of it.
Sure. Well, there's a kind of catchphrase from earlier time in like the 60s, like a repetition or repetition as originality, or if you do something over and over again, then it becomes something new. But often there is nonetheless the idea of a beginning and an end. It's not necessarily a futile or infinite repetition. In a number of projects I've been doing, kind of using video to map a space. So I might have a grid that's either the joists of a building in a basement where the grid's exposed, and I move the camera along and you see the floor, and then I move it to the next place, and I move it to the next place. So there's measuring, and so the routine or the repetition is moving from one view to the next view to the next view, but I don't cut when I'm moving the view, so you get these strange things where the camera is moving and the point of view is very different than you might have if it were intended to be like the point of view of a character.
And so is there something about maybe ritual or the importance of ritual in repetition?
Sure, but I would think of it in a secular way, in the sense that I mean, people could bring a lot of things to this themselves, but to me, it's there is something psychologically comforting. I mean, there's also limits of endurance too, but this idea of losing yourself within something or defocusing your attention, and which in a way is the opposite of something which is very high attention value. So in a way, I understand the images that I'm putting out. I realize they're not highly entertaining in the sense, but they're positioned almost more like installation art or sculpture in terms of how people would encounter it in the gallery. I mean, they're not chained to their seat. They can come and go. They can look at it as a sort of element in space and decide what kind of relationship they want to take up to it, particularly because as I'm trying to work with the space, where the spectator is positioned is very important to how they get the image and where I am in relation to that.
So yeah, speaking about the use of space, you mentioned earlier Dan Graham as one of your inspirations, and he's known for using the video medium, but in how it relates to architectural space.
Sure, and this I mean, I guess I would say that the important thing to emphasize, and again, we're talking about the period of his work from the 70s, which I find most interesting. I mean, because he still does a lot of things now that are more in like building pavilions that in a way draw on his past work. But this particular time when he produced this thing called video architecture television and a whole series of works that used cameras, live video cameras, mirrors, monitors, in different spatial configurations to create really interesting relationships between spectators and each other, or people looking from one position to another, being mirrored or reflected. And I guess his analysis of architecture is a lot less to do with, let's say, the formal aspects. People might think about like the shape of buildings. It's more about how they function as environments and what their role in society is, and how space structures people's experience. And that's not necessarily the same thing as architectural design in the sense that architects might want to think about it. So he's talking about architecture, but in this larger kind of socio-spatial context. And I mean, this question of mirrors is also very important to his work, which one, obviously, because they reflect people, and you change the way you see yourself, and you change the way a space is by putting a mirror, because in a way it doubles the space, but it's no deeper. You know, the mirror is infinitesimal, and so this was something that's quite interesting in the history of architecture. People sometimes think about how modern architecture was given a big stimulus by the introduction of mirrors in a large scale in the 18th century, particularly in France, where palaces would start to be experienced differently because of the depth and multiplication, and the idea of mirroring the depth with two mirrors, and so that you have this idea of virtual spaces. Sort of, I mean, Graham is more getting at a kind of psychological dimension of the spectator, and also there's kind of some people see a kind of psychoanalytic dimension in terms of the reflecting the self on, or subject or the spectator or themselves onto their own consciousness. And So I guess I'm trying to learn something from this, but do something different, because I guess but what I do take is that a real attention to the site and the experience of spectators, something that's grounded in a specific space. I don't make, there's wonderful artifacts that people make, paintings, objects that are kind of independent of a site.
Space,
it can be sent anywhere, as long as there's more or less adequate lighting, you can see what it is and get the idea. In my case, the space where the work is experienced is part of the work, and it's a double-edged sword in a way, because you have to, if you take responsibility for it, you have to accept what it brings, but then it gives inspiration and gives a thing to work from. And so I find it actually really hard to generate work independently of a site, so I wait to find a location to generate something.
Tim, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks a lot.